For this segment of our training, we're going to be talking about the people and cultures that were present when James Marshall discovered gold. And of course, we need to start off with the Native Americans, and we're at their village site here in the park. Now, the people that lived here, the Native Americans, were known as the Nisenons. They're a subgroup of the Maidao people, and they lived all through the foothills of the Sierras here and onto the flat, the valley floor. So they're a hunting and gathering people. The women gathered, and this area was so prolific in food sources that a woman could gather in 3 days enough food to supply her family for a week. Men hunted. Everybody liked meat. So they occupied this little village site for probably around 1,500, 2,000 years. We gauge that by the depth of the bedrock mortar holes that you see behind me. Once you get these holes established, they don't wear very rapidly. And so that's how we determine that. So they lived in peace here for many, many years. And then in 1847, James Marshall appears with a group of Mormons and the Wimmer family. And of course, they were here to build the sawmill. Now, Marshall and the Mormon boys and the Wimmer family got along great with the Native Americans here. They didn't have any problem with them whatsoever. The Native Americans were very curious about these people from Sutter's Fort. But that all changed. In the summer of 1848, a large group of men from Oregon came down to mine for gold. They had established themselves in the Willamette Valley, and they had to fight the Native Americans there for control of that valley. And when they came down here and saw how chummy everybody was with the Native Americans, they didn't like that. And they certainly weren't going to compete for gold with people that they thought were way, way beneath them. So a group of these men were up on the North Fork of the American River looking for gold, and they ran onto an Indian village. They killed a man and brutalized a woman. When the rest of the Native Americans in that village came back to their village site and found out what went on, they took off after these guys, and they caught them at a place we now call Murderer's Bar. And they killed 3 of these Oregon miners. The rest of them came back here to Coloma, started drinking, and decided that they were going to take revenge on the people that lived in this little village. Now, James Marshall, who knew these people well, tried to intercede. He said these people didn't have anything to do with what went on up there. The miners didn't care. They caught the 7 Native American men that were in this village site and took them over to a makeshift pen while they decided what to do with them. They decided to hang them. When the Native Americans found out what was going to happen to them, they took off in all directions. And the miners went after them and murdered every one of them. Then they got on their horses. Oh, and by the way, they also tried to murder James Marshall. They were going to hang him too. He was able to break free from them and get out of here, even though they pursued him. Those men got on their horses and they rode towards Placerville, where they ran into a Native American village. They killed 30 people. They went towards Sacramento, found another village, killed 20 more. At which point the Native Americans here scattered. The women all ran to Jenny Wimmer, pleading with her to stop what was going on. And she told them, I can't. I don't know these people. So the Native Americans were dispersed from this place of peace, for 1,500, 2,000 years. And they were pushed into areas where they couldn't support themselves. And so the final piece of the Native Americans' destruction begins here. Now let me tell you something about the populations here. When the Spaniards arrived in California, there were about 300,000 Native Americans here. By the time of the gold rush, that number was down to 30,000. mainly because of European diseases, which these people had no immunity to. Oftentimes, a Native American would escape from one of the missions on the coast and go back to a village or cross into the San Joaquin Valley or the foothills of the Sierras carrying a disease. Whole villages would die, and none of those people had ever even seen a white person. So the Native Americans' numbers continued to decline through starvation, murder, and their lowest point was 1900. That census, the census of 1900, shows 16,000 Native Americans here in California. Today, the census shows about 400,000 Native Americans, but the census doesn't tell us who they are. In other words, a Native American here could be a Navajo or a Hopi or an Aleut. So we really don't know how many California natives are still here. But this is our heritage. Not a very good one. We always hear of the Native Americans utilizing acorns and buckeyes as food. Well, the problem with the acorn and the buckeye is that they're full of tannic acid, so we've got to remove the acid. So the first step in the process is go out and gather a bunch of acorns and buckeyes. The buckeyes have a really nice shell on them. It's fairly easy to peel off. The acorns, though, have a very hard shell, and so we're going to have to break that shell open. So the Native American women would sit on this rock, and they would utilize a little hole like this. They'd take an acorn, put it up on its end, take a rock, whack it, peel the shell off of it, and throw the acorn into the hole. Then they're going to take their pestle, and they're going to grind all that stuff up into a mush. They'll remove that, take it down to the river, or there's two ways to do this. You can either put the mush in a bucket, in a basket, a waterproof basket, watertight basket, and put water in there, and then the water is hot. Put hot water in the basket, and that will leach the acid out. The other way is to take the mush down to a slow-moving stream of water, put large leaves down on the bottom of the stream, put the mush on top of it, and allow water to course over the top of it. Tasting it every once in a while to see how bitter it is. Once it's no longer bitter, it's edible. Then they'd dry that, use it as just, well, they might heat it and eat it as a mush, use it as flour to make unleavened bread. Lots of things that you can do once you have it in that form. And because they lived here in the wintertime, they would store their food in granaries. And I think we'll show you one of those here in a moment. Over my right shoulder is an umakwa. This is a bark house. And these things are very comfortable inside. There would be a fire pit right in the center. And then around that, the Native Americans would put pine needles all over the floor. That's the cushion. And then over that, they would lay deer hides with the fur up. So it'd be pretty cozy in there. Got a nice little fire going. You're sitting on a nice animal hide. So over my left shoulder is a chaka. And a chaka is basically a granary or cache. This is where the Native Americans stored food for the winter. By the end of fall, those things would be full of acorns and buckeyes. And it wouldn't just be one. There would be numerous ones in the village. They would be guarded by the little Native American boys with their bows and arrows, because of course the squirrels and other animals wanted to get in there. And also the camp dogs. Native Americans had small dogs, 30, 35 pounds, short hair, long tail that curved up over the back. We're standing in front of the Wahop store. This building and the one next to it were constructed of native stone, and they were built by an American contractor and leased to Chinese businessmen. So this is the Wahop store, and next door here we have the Manly hardware store. So the Chinese in California. When gold was discovered in California, there were 3 Chinese people in San Francisco. 2 sailors and a woman. The sailors immediately went to the gold fields. The woman became a maid for some wealthy people in San Francisco. Now, in the census of 1850, it doesn't show very many Chinese here at all. But the census of 1860 shows that in the 13 gold rush counties, 33% of the population is Chinese. Here in Coloma in 1860, 28%. Placerville, 33%. El Dorado, 33%. So they own businesses here. Not only these 2 businesses, but there was a hotel here that also catered to no one but Chinese. So the Chinese called California Gold Mountain. And most of the people that came from China to California were from southern China, around Canton. There was a war going on there and a famine. And that area of China had always been known for its sojourners. When your family got too big, or if something was going on like a war or a famine, people left. They went to Indochina, they went to the Philippines, wherever. So it wasn't a big deal for them to come to California. And it was very inexpensive. It was $60 to come from Canton to San Francisco. Whereas coming across the plains, just your supplies alone are going to cost you several $100s. Your wagon and all your equipment, you're probably talking something like $400 or $500. If you went by ship from Boston or New York to San Francisco around the Horn, same thing, $400 or $500. So lots of Chinese came to California. And they came here with the very same idea as everyone else. They came here to get rich and go home. And in a sense, they did a better job of that than most of the miners. At first, they were a curiosity to the other people here. But later on, when people realized how hardworking they were, they realized that they're a threat. So every year they were finding less and less gold per individual. And finally the Chinese started doing some more traditional things. They opened laundries, they started growing vegetables to sell to the miners. And this is one of those odd cases when prejudice works for a people. Unlike most of the miners, they really stuck to their guns. They came here to get rich and go home. And as these other miners, oftentimes farm boys, never been more than 20 miles from home, as they dissipated themselves with drinking and gambling, the Chinese saved their money. They had a goal. They weren't liked here, and they wanted to go home. So this all came to a head here in Coloma in March of 1861. The Chinese miners had asked to some business owners downtown if they could tear down buildings that were not being used and mine under the buildings. That ground had never been mined. And a group of Irish miners said, hey, we want to do that. Now this became quite a dispute. And so an arbitrator from San Francisco came out and arbitrated the dispute and found in favor of the Chinese. At which point, the Irishmen, who were all down at Bell's Saloon, drunk, ran out of that building and ran down to Chinatown. Chinatown is down this way. It's beyond the Native American village. They went into Chinatown and just tore it apart. They broke every door, every window, every chair, table, plate. They killed 2 Chinese by picking them up and slamming them to the ground repeatedly. Some people here in town were trying to protect the Chinese. The sheriff was here, but he couldn't do anything. He didn't have a posse. And so the sheriff took a pencil and paper and started writing names down, perpetrators and witnesses. And a day later, he came back here to Coloma with a posse, and they started arresting these guys. And they caught 13 of them. A lot of them knew what was going to happen to them and took off. Those men were put in jail, and they were all fined $200 apiece in gold. They were not released until the fines were paid. 2 of the men were charged with murder, One of them got 4 years in the penitentiary and the other one got a year. And the Chinese got nothing. In fact, the editor of the Mountain Democrat newspaper wrote an editorial saying that the Chinese are just a dirty problem that we've got to deal with. But out of this, the county got $3,600 in good, clean money. So, a few years after that, the Central Pacific Railroad is hiring laborers. Now, this is in 1862-63. The Civil War is going on. Labor is at a shortage here. And they decided, let's hire a few Chinese. We'll give them light jobs because they're small people. They probably can't handle the heavy work. Well, they found that they could do any job that they were asked to do. And by the time the Central Pacific Railroad was finished building in 1869, 90% of the people working for the railroad were Chinese. They made $35 a month plus room and board. And they felt that was a better deal than working in those gold fields. In fact, the railroad needed so many people, so many laborers, that they actually went to China and hired more people to work on the railroad. A lot of those people built railroads all over the West after the Central Pacific was done. And a lot of them went home. There were numerous groups that came to the gold rush. Not just the Chinese, but people basically from everywhere. Every continent was represented other than Antarctica. Lots of people came from Mexico, Chile, some from Argentina, but they weren't generally around in this area. Their influence was more to the south in the gold fields. And unfortunately, most of those people did not keep a record. Lots of people up here kept diaries and so forth, and that just wasn't the case in the southern mines. And so our resources are limited when we talk about what was going on down around Colombia and Sonora and those places. At Chile Bar, we had a tremendous number of Chileanos. And of course, some of those people were 48ers. They were actually here in 1848, prior to the rush of 1849. We had a large group of Irish people here, Irish men. Of course, this is the time of the potato famine in Ireland, and people are trying to get out of there. They're starving to death there. The British government was, well, the British government stated that in a 10-year period, they kicked 240,000 families off the land in Ireland. Those people had to go somewhere, and a lot of them came here. So we have that influence here, and we also had a number of black people that came here. And of course, our most famous ones are the Gooch family, and Gooch Monroe family, I should say. Nancy Gooch and her husband came here as slaves in 1849, and in 1850, when California became a state, they were given manumission. Manumission is a legal document that states that you are now your own person. And they had a problem. First of all, they needed to work to survive, and they also had a son who was married and had a family in Missouri. And it was their intent to get their family back together. And so they worked very, very hard. They were very diligent. Nancy Gooch was a good cook, and she also would do laundry. Two things that the miners, almost all of whom were farm boys, didn't do and didn't want to do. And so Nancy made a lot of money. And with that money, she bought her son out of slavery and brought him and his family here, and they prospered. The Monroe House is here in the park. That's a house that they didn't actually live in. They leased that out to other people. They also owned the blacksmith shop, and they owned a large tract of land, which we now call the Monroe Orchard, and that's where their big house was down there. They prospered in this valley, and they were well-off people. They all went to public school just like everybody else. Most of them are buried in our cemetery, the Pioneer Cemetery. There was a problem with the family, though. Some of them married, but they never had any children. And so the Gooch family, the Monroe Gooch family, died out. But they weren't the only black family here. There was the Burgesses, the Davises. These are large families. Mr. Burgess was a blacksmith. He came here as a freedman in 1860. They too prospered here. I was talking to one of our guests one day, a black lady. I told him this story, and she said, with a smile on her face, they were under the radar, weren't they? And I knew what she meant. Yeah, they were accepted here. They were accepted people here, and that's why they prospered.